Boy, you're slick. You invested
Thank you for tuning in to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, June 2nd, 2022, and we are streaming live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. I'm Mary Massey with co-host John Sakowicz. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary, and good morning to our audience here in Northern California and listening to the web stream throughout the country and the world. I want to say that tomorrow is my birthday, and on my Facebook page, I set up a giving page for KMUD. That's what I want people to do to help me celebrate my birthday. Last year, we raised I think $333, and I think I only had it up one day. Mary and I do great programming. Today is a good example. It's a show on Congress's recent hearings on UFOs, and our guest is probably the country's biggest, most credible specialist on UFOs. And we're able to bring you that because of this station. Nobody gets paid a lot at this station. We're not the big corporate public radio model. We're the small, people-powered community radio model. So please help this station and this show by supporting KMUD. And you can do that very easily just by going to my Facebook page. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that terrific offer. Today's program and all programs will be archived here at kmud.org and also at our program website, heroespatriots.org. We are also on Facebook and YouTube. We invite you as listeners to call in with questions for our guests, 707-923-3911. We do ask that you be brief and not make so much commentary just so others can have a chance. Dorothy Sakura returns to the studio today to do our engineering. Thank you, Dorothy. And we're going to get started. You know, John, this is a topic I don't think we've ever covered in our 4 or 5 years together.
I want to say this much. I'm jumping out of my skin to speak with our guest. Some folks ask me, some friends ask me, why UFOs and how does that relate to your show, which focuses on national security? And keep in mind, our show goes way beyond the borders of our broadcast area. We post to a lot of sites. PRX picks it up. Radio for All, Pacifica's Radio for All picks it up. Even Al Jazeera has quoted us. And we've got a lot of friends in the national security community who listen to the show. And UFOs are a security issue, which is why Congress, the House Committee on Intelligence, held hearings on UFOs last month on May 17th.
Right. And John, it had been 50 years since Congress had hearings about UFOs. They've even renamed it. So we're going to answer some of these questions like, why now? Why are they talking about this now? And this hearing, I should mention, was held in the interest of the national defense. So to answer this question and more, John and I are speaking through the entire program with Professor Abraham Loeb. Dr. Avi Loeb is the Frank B. Baird Jr. Professor of Science at Harvard University. He's also a best-selling author, having written 8 books. He received his PhD from physics from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem at the tender age of 24. And he's been a long-term member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. As I mentioned, he's written 8 books, and the last one called Extraterrestrial, very appropriate for our program. In 2012, Time magazine selected Professor Loeb as one of the 25 most influential people in space. And in 2020, Dr. Loeb was selected among the 14 most inspiring Israelis of the last decade. We can go on and on. He has many, many credentials. And so this is the real deal.
Well, he chairs the Astrophysics department at Harvard. You forgot that.
And the Galileo Project, all of which we're going to be speaking about. So first of all, we'd like to welcome Professor Abraham Loeb. Hello.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Wonderful. Well, welcome to the program. As we were talking in the beginning of the program, this is really the first time we've had a program on this subject, and both John and I perked up when we saw that the hearings were going to take place last month. Could you speak to why, in your opinion, this has become important now? Why are they holding and informing the public about UFOs?
Well, it's difficult for the government to ignore facts or evidence that is reported by military personnel, and we currently have technologies that can provide us with much more accurate data about objects that we see in the sky. And it looks like some of the reports imply objects that are not explained naturally as birds or other natural phenomena, or as human-made objects, because they behave in strange ways, and the government cannot figure out what these objects are. The claim is that some of them are detected in with multiple instruments, so they can't be just a fake. They cannot be malfunction of the instruments, and of course, it's a matter of national security, because the key question is whether there is another nation that maybe has technologies we don't fully understand, or irrespective, it poses some threat to military personnel. There were, in the congressional hearing a couple of weeks ago, there was a mention of 11 cases of near-miss incidents where an object came very close to an aircraft and endangered the pilot. So obviously the Congress and the political system, the government, wants to understand the nature of these objects. And President Biden signed into law a new office in government that would look into assembling the data, coordinating between different sections of government, and most importantly, removing the stigma from a discussion on objects that we can't fully understand. So that's what it comes to with respect to the government. But then from the scientific perspective, I was brought into the subject of objects we don't fully understand by data from telescopes. Over the past decade, we observed the first 3 objects that came from outside the solar system. And the first 2 of them, one of which I discovered with my student at Harvard University, Amir Siraj. The first one was a meteor discovered in 2014, and it was tougher than iron. It was moving very fast, faster than stars are moving relative to the sun outside the solar system. So it looks like an outlier. And the second object was discovered by a telescope in Hawaii. It was given the name of Oumuamua, and it didn't look like a comet or an asteroid, the type of rocks we had seen before from the solar system. So, the third one was just a comet. So 1 out of the 3 is quite familiar, but 2 out of the 3 are unusual. And for me as an astronomer, I thought it's a message nature is giving us that, perhaps we don't fully understand what's outside our solar system.
Dr. Loeb, please tell our audience who the witnesses were at this House Intelligence Committee meeting, and what did they say?
Right. So there were 2 representatives from the Department of Defense, and they talked about. One of them was from the Navy, and the other one was from the Department of Defense, and they were talking about the type of reports they're getting. And of course, for many years, there was a stigma on such reports. People were afraid of talking about unusual objects because it looked crazy to some people. And now it looks as if the stigma is removed, and there is, especially in the Navy, there is a formal procedure by which pilots can report if they see something unusual. So that's a big change, because a lot of reports were suppressed because of the stigma. And obviously, there are some pilots that say that it's a repeating pattern that they see such objects, and we would like to know what they are. And the government obviously is motivated by 2 issues. One is national security. So there is a question of whether someone is spying on us. or doing something in our sky, and obviously we want to know about it. And the second is the safety of the military personnel. And so the entire discussion in Congress was revolving around these two issues because that's what is of concern to the government more generally, the military in particular. But from a scientific point of view, it's a completely different issue. So the government has to pay attention to every report that is being filed, even if the data is very low quality. And there was one, video show during the congressional hearing that wasn't very convincing because it was taken with a cell phone and camera, and to me as a scientist, it wasn't really convincing. So, but the government has to pay attention to every report. For science, it's completely different. For science, what we want is the highest quality data, so that we can analyze it and get our assessment. And it's sufficient to have one object of extraterrestrial technological origin, something that is not natural on Earth, that came from outside of this Earth and was manufactured by another civilization. For that to be extremely important, extremely significant, just one, it may be a mixed bag. Lots of objects might be natural, might be human-made. We don't care about it. We just want high-quality data on one object. And the government, of course, has a completely different perspective on this.
Dr. Loeb, I did a Freedom of Information request at the Department of Defense for UFO sightings, and with the CIA in particular, and I was astonished at the number of reports that the CIA has generated over the last 50 years on UFOs. Probably well over 100 reports. A lot of them are completely redacted, especially when it comes to sightings or intelligence analysis of sightings over the former Soviet Union. Why such the secrecy in the past, and why the change in openness now?
Yeah, so obviously the secrecy is because there was suspicion that maybe these objects belong to another nation, and as a matter of national intelligence, you don't want to reveal what you know and what you detected. But I should say the Director of National Intelligence released a report to Congress last June, in June 2021. And in that report, there were 140 cases mentioned. But in the congressional hearing a few weeks ago, it was mentioned that by now there are 400 of them. So obviously, there are many more. I think, it's in principle, if you remove the stigma, there would be many more reports. And it's not so much the low quality data that is collected by, pilots in the cockpits of fighter jets. What I, as a scientist, care mostly about is what is the best quality data the government has that's classified, and it could have been obtained, for example, by satellites. Satellites are monitoring, so you could see an unidentified object from above, not from below. And I'm sure the government, based on some statements made by officials, for example, the former CIA director, Ratcliffe, said that they have some satellite imagery data that is quite compelling. And obviously that will not be declassified because, they're worried about revealing the capabilities of our sensors.
I see.
But if you think about it, the sky itself is not classified. It's just the sensors that are classified. So that led me to establish a scientific project called the Galileo Project, where we are trying to collect our own data.
An example of some of the sightings, before I ask my question. Photo reveals a semicircle formation of lights. Object with 20 square lights on two sides. Vertical bar of lights found in trail cam photo. Bright flash in blue sky for a few seconds. Line-shaped object with lights on top and bottom. Blue asymmetrical object on left of moon. White oval-shaped object with yellow lights on bottom. Strange-shaped object photographed by moon. No two of these sightings seem any seem alike in any way. They seem so different. Would this imply that we're being visited by more than one species of alien? Or, I mean, what does that tell you?
Well, I should say, it may sound like a mixed bag in the sense that, some of the reports may result from instruments that have, that provide the artifacts, and some of them may be associated with human-made objects. The key is really to get enough data on even a single object, such that we can infer its nature, such that we can clearly conclude that it's not human-made and not natural.
Do you think Roswell was such an example of a high quality crash?
No, I would argue that at the moment, the declassified data from the government is not convincing. Okay, so what was made public is not of sufficient quality to make us confident that indeed they identified something that is not natural or human-made. But it's possible that the government has better data that they haven't publicized, they haven't declassified, and that's why there are so many government officials talking about it seriously, because they would not spend 90 minutes of a congressional hearing discussing objects that are just a fluke, that are nothing. So my guess is they have some much better data. We don't have access to it. However, the good news is we can get that data, even better data than that ourselves, because you can buy off-the-shelf instrumentation and build telescope systems that will give us imagery of the sky, continuous video of the sky, and will identify objects that are unusual. And that's what we are planning to do in the Galileo project that I'm heading.
Tell us more about the Galileo project.
Yeah, so about a year ago, when the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, yes, I'm with you. Sorry about, I'm not sure why it's disconnected. And at any event, the Galileo project aims to build telescope systems that will monitor the sky in various locations. And the first one is being assembled right now on the roof of the Harvard College Observatory. And within a month, we will know if it's working as we expect. And it will include a visible light and infrared and light cameras that monitor the entire sky all the time, and as well as radio sensors and audio sensors. And the data will be fed to a computer system that will analyze it using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and we will try to figure out what kind of objects we see on the sky. And of course, once such a system works, we will make copies of it and distribute them in various locations. And at the moment, we are funded with a little over $2 million, and we can build a few of those systems. The hope is to get to the level of $100 million funding, so that we can put hundreds of those systems in different locations, and then we will get to the bottom of the question of what these unexplained objects are in the sky. And it's like a fishing expedition. We don't assume what we will find. We are just collecting data, and this data will be open to the public, and it will be clear how we obtained it. We fully understand our instruments. So in a way, that would be the best path to understanding what the government is reporting about.
Talk about the huge flat asteroid that was spotted a couple of years ago that appeared to be a solar wind sail. What was that sighting all about?
Yeah, so in 2017, a telescope in Hawaii called Pan-STARRS detected a near-Earth object which was moving too fast to be bound to the sun. So it was the first object that was identified that came from outside the solar system, and that's called an interstellar object. And the astronomers at first thought, oh, it must be a comet, but there was no cometary tail. There was no evaporation of gas from ices on this object, and then as it was tumbling every 8 hours, the amount of sunlight reflected from it changed by a factor of 10. So that meant that it has a very extreme shape, most likely flat, based on the analysis of the variation of light. And then it was pushed away from the sun by some force, and that force could not have been the rocket effect as a result of evaporation, because we haven't seen any gas around it. So the only explanation I could think of is that it's a thin, flat object, and sort of like a sail that is being pushed by reflecting sunlight. So that was the first indication that, you know, an object from outside the solar system looks weird and perhaps is of technological origin. But it turns out, a couple of years later, with my student, we discovered another object that was actually reported in 2014, and that's a meteor, an object that burned up in the lower atmosphere near Papua New Guinea on January 8th, 2014, and that was actually the very first interstellar object we found, and it predated the other one by almost 4 years. And actually, we are planning an expedition to scoop the ocean floor for any fragments left over from that meteor. In a few months, we hope to get there.
You know, you mentioned the Pan-STARRS telescope that's situated in Hawaii that captured the 2017 phenomenon, if you will. Is that the most sophisticated? You mentioned the Galileo project is going to replicate over 100 times ways to capture and investigate and study space. Is that the most sophisticated? And also, do other countries have like telescopes?
Yeah, so the first thing I would like to mention is that only over the past decade we were able to search for objects from outside the solar system. Oumuamua, this first object reported in 2017, was the size of a football field. And NASA never launched an object as big as a football field as a spacecraft. So we're only, and the meteor that I mentioned from 2014, that was roughly half a meter in size. So only over the past decade, we were able to detect objects from outside the solar system. Before that, we just didn't have a survey telescope that could alert us to such objects. So it's a relatively new frontier of discovery. And in the past, when people talked about looking for technologies from other civilizations, they were thinking about looking for radio signals from a distant star, which is very different. You need the counterpart to be active at the time that you're listening. But here, you're looking for objects, physical objects that were sent by other civilizations, and that's more like archaeology, where you're searching for physical objects. And that is a very different approach. You don't need the sender to be alive when you're finding the relics. They may have died 1 billion years ago if they predated us. And all we are looking for are objects in our neighborhood. And also it poses a new question as to how to deal. If you find a functioning object, what do you do about it? We don't have a protocol. There is no organization that represents humanity. And what do we do about it? Because it's in our backyard, and we have to decide how to engage with it.
It's 9:29, and we are going to take a brief 30-second pause just to collect ourselves. This is Heroes and Patriots, and we'll return in a moment. And this is Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy, and it is June 2nd, 2022. I'm Mary Massey, and John Sakowicz is with me here co-hosting. I wanted to remind listeners that you can call in at 707-923-3911 if you have a question for our guest today, Dr. Avi Loeb. And we were just talking about the Pan-STARRS telescope and like equipment, and you were reflecting that this has only really been available to scientists in the last 10 years. I'm curious, are you required to report, you mentioned there's no real protocol, but are you required to report such findings to, say, the White House or the military or National Defense Department?
No, we have a scientific project, and in the context of science, the data that we obtain is openly shared with everyone. Because if you think about it, what we are looking for, some other civilization out there, that's not a matter of national security. It's it's a matter of international interest. Another civilization will not adhere to the borders between nations. Just like if we walk if a pedestrian walks on a sidewalk, the pedestrian would not care about which corner of the pavement is occupied by a colony of ants. They won't really care about the nations we have on Earth, and so it's not a national concern, and it's more to do with humanity as a whole. And we were not asked to share our data, specifically with the government. We are not dealing with any. Obviously, if we notice anything that is of no scientific interest, but of national security interest, of course, we will be glad to provide it to the government. That will not be of interest to us. So
Dr. Loeb, we have a caller for you if you would like to accept that. Caller, if you're listening, go ahead with your brief question.
Yes, thank you. It's very exciting to hear about this new scientific frontier moving into the realm of serious science. And I'm just wondering, building on what you said about international interest, and the idea of protocols, and building on Mary's earlier question about telescopes. There are telescopes, huge telescopes in Chile and South Africa and elsewhere around the world. Do you have a network of scientists who are working with you on this to build for protocols and to reinforce the data that you're finding and writing about?
Yeah, so we do have the Galileo project, as I mentioned. There are about more than 100 people involved in it, and we are building our own telescopes, but also we plan to use publicly available data, for example, from the Vera Rubin Observatory that will start operations in a year in Chile, which is funded by the National Science Foundation, because it will survey the sky with much greater capability than any telescope in the past. So we should be able to find more objects like Oumuamua, this object that was discovered in 2017, on which I have the book, Extraterrestrial. If we find more objects, you can think of this telescope as a dating app. Most of the time we might swipe to the left and decide not to take any such object, but every now and then there would be a sufficiently peculiar object that we might want to come close to and date. And that would require a space mission that will get close to it. And obviously it will cost more than $1 billion to do it. And we are currently planning the design of such a space mission once the Vera Rubin Observatory will provide the alerts. I should say that's expensive. There is a less costly approach, which is to look at objects that collide with the Earth. So, for example, this meteor from 2014, that came from outside the solar system, and we can go and search for the fragments left behind from it, and that will cost a few $1 million for this expedition, which is 1,000 times less expensive, and that's what we are trying first.
I want to talk about secrecy. There is a theory that the secrecy involving UFO investigations goes way back to Harry Truman. And in fact, this may have been the genesis of what some call the shadow government in the United States. That there are things that the government knows, a very few people in the government knows, that they don't share with anyone, including members of Congress and maybe even the United States. And it was something called the Majestic 12. And the Majestic 12 was a pretty high-powered group, pretty high-octane group. General Floyd Vandenberg, who was the first Secretary of the Air Force, and Vandenberg Air Force Base is named after him. Roscoe Hillenkoetter, Director of the CIA. James Forrestal, last Secretary of the Navy. So 12 highly influential, all defense industry connected people, and that all UFO investigations went to them. And that was the genesis of all the secrecy and all the black funding for UFO research. Do you have any thinking about that?
Yeah, so what I would imagine is that, in the old days, it was thought maybe, these objects that were detected belong to other nations, and therefore that should be secret. Also, you have to understand that, when intelligence agencies figure out there is something they don't fully understand, they would rather not report about it, because that shows their incompetence. If they say, there are objects in the sky above the U.S. that we cannot figure out, it implies that, they're not capable of identifying all the risks that there might be to national security. So they would rather not report about it. They would rather, keep it secret, hidden from public view, and discuss it as little as possible, including the military itself. The Air Force would rather not speak about aircraft that they cannot really figure out. And so there is clearly a tendency to secrecy, first when you don't understand something, and second when you don't want others to think that you're not competent enough to figure out everything. So that would be my interpretation. It's not done as a result of trying to hide something because they know what we don't know about the identity of these objects. It's just that they can't really figure out what these are, and they prefer other people not to know that they can't figure it out. So that would be my interpretation. I don't believe in any conspiracy of the government that knows a lot and doesn't want to share the knowledge with us, because I think fundamentally the government is incompetent. You see, they're not scientists. They don't have the skills to figure out the nature of such objects. I think it's the duty of scientists to help the government, and we should just clear up the fog and figure out what these things are. What are they? I mean, if we get a high resolution image, we can see that there are bolts and screws on the object. We can tell that it's not a rock or a bird or something else, and we might even read the label made on exoplanet Y, if it came from another planet.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm in total agreement with you on that. In New York, in 2017, I think it was, the New York Times published a story headline, "Glowing Auras of Black Money," the Patriots UFO program. But they could have just as easily said, "Glowing Auras, Black Money, and the Pentagon's incompetent UFO program." I think the money should go to scientists like you. Are you enjoying any success beyond the Galileo project in that regard?
Well, so far we are funded by donors, wealthy individuals. We are not funded by government agencies or traditional funding agencies of science like the National Science Foundation or NASA. I tried to reach out to NASA but didn't get a response. And, partly it's because the committees that allocate funds to research are populated by experts, so-called experts that prefer not to venture into the unknown. They usually always work on things that are well accepted, well known, so that they reflect their past knowledge. And there is very little tolerance to taking risks, trying to, understand something that looks anomalous. And that's why I'm getting funded mostly by the private sector. And there is a huge amount of interest in the public, and and obviously in the government, trying to figure out these objects. So I think it's completely inappropriate for the academic community or the scientific community to ignore this subject, to ridicule it, or not to engage with it. I think it's the duty of science to actually help the government and the general public figure out what these objects are.
I would think that with the interest of the super billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Craig Virgin in space flight, that they would be natural funders of your kind of research. Are you enjoying any progress with these very, extremely high net worth, ultra high net worth people and your program?
Well, not those necessarily. I was in the green room of the Washington National Cathedral about 6 months ago with Jeff Bezos, and he's mostly into space tourism, commercializing space. It's not as much about trying to figure out the unknown, what's out there. And I very much hope that he or Elon Musk or any other visionary space leader at some point will get interested and inspired by this. And I should say that nevertheless there are a huge number of people that approach me all the time. And just last week there was the commencement at Harvard, where the main speaker was the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and she came along with a group of people, one of whom was a documentary filmmaker. And as soon as they arrived to campus, he wanted to meet with me and came to the porch of my home and interviewed me for 3 hours. And so this subject is obviously of interest also down under. My book obviously was translated to 25 languages, and there is a huge amount of interest in the subject. So I think eventually we will figure it out. A lot of people have a problem with thinking about the possibility that there might be a smarter kid on our cosmic block. They want to think that we are unique and special and privileged. But I wouldn't guess that's the case. I think we have a lot to learn from our neighbors.
Do you find that for the most part your astrophysicist colleagues support what you're doing? Are they jealous of you? What has been the response to your book Extraterrestrial, which we want to know more about, but also just in general, where you seem so open and willing to just go into it full force? Are most scientists this way?
Yeah, so there was a lot of pushback, especially from the conservative mainstream of the academic community. But, for example, with respect to this object, Oumuamua, the argument was, it must be natural. It must be a rock. And then when people try to explain the anomalies of this object, they always talked about a rock of a type that we've never seen before, like a chunk of frozen hydrogen or a chunk of frozen nitrogen or a dust bunny. These are things we've never seen before, and they were needed in order to explain the unusual behavior of Oumuamua, this object from 2017. So to me, that immediately implies that we should consider an artificial origin as well, because a cave dweller finding a cell phone would also argue that it's a rock of a type we've never seen before. So there was a lot of pushback. I think part of it is jealousy, as you mentioned, from the public attention to the subject. Part of it is experts wanting to, explain anything they see in the sky in the form of rocks. Okay, so they will never give up on that. just to maintain their territory of being experts and being able to explain everything in terms of their past knowledge. So they would resist any new knowledge. To me, it's quite disappointing that people are not open-minded within academia, whereas the general public, the government, and even spiritual people, religious people are very open-minded about discussing it. I do think in the long run, the evidence will guide us. It will prevail. So the issue is really whether we collect the evidence or decide not to do it. And of course, the best way to maintain your ignorance is not to collect evidence. Like Enrico Fermi 70 years ago asked, where is everybody about the extraterrestrials? And of course, he was not using any telescopes to look out. And it's just like, saying, where are my neighbors without looking through the windows? You can't, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like the approach of an ostrich to bury your head or raise enough dust and say, I don't see anything. If you really want to find, you need to invest funds in the search. You need to work on it. There was also a quote from Carl Sagan, which is repeated very often. It says, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, first of all, the possibility of another kid on our cosmic block, of another intelligent civilization, is not extraordinary. We know that we exist. We send out equipment to space, and we know that half of the sun-like stars have a planet like the Earth. So it's not extraordinary at all. And I don't think of ourselves as extraordinary, because if you look at the daily news, it's clear that there is a lot of room for improvement. We are not extraordinary. Things like us could have existed billions of years ago. We should just search for it. And what I argue is that extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary funding. If you're not funding the search, you will not find anything.
Dr. Loeb, we know a lot more about quantum physics than we did 50 years ago. Wormholes and such, superposition. There is some who think that all UFOs don't necessarily come from our universe. That these are interdimensional travelers coming from wormholes. They appear and then they disappear through the same wormhole, and they occasionally visit us. So they're not necessarily all objects from this universe, this observable universe. And keeping in mind, most of the universe is dark matter and dark energy. What would you say to people who think that?
Well, first of all, we have to keep in mind that our modern science is only a century old. Quantum mechanics and relativity were discovered about 100 years ago. And so our science is really at its infancy, just at the beginning. And there are lots of things that we don't fully understand. For example, we don't know what most of the matter in the universe is. We call it dark matter. We just don't know what its nature is. So we are clearly ignorant. For 100 years, we studied the universe. We still don't know what it's made of. That's pretty dismal in terms of our accomplishments. And if you ask scientists that work in cosmology, they would say, "Oh, we know so much." But actually, if you boil it down, we don't even know what the universe is made of. That's quite. It implies that we are missing something. Also, we don't know how to unify quantum mechanics and gravity. These are two pillars of modern physics, and we just don't know how to combine them, to bring them together. And there are lots of scientists, physicists trying to do that and have been working on that for half a century, and they would claim that they made all kinds of mathematical gymnastics that allows them to imagine possible unification schemes. But none of these were tested against data. None of them makes a prediction that we can verify. None of them explain to us what happened before the Big Bang, what happens inside the black hole. So clearly our knowledge is just an island in an ocean of ignorance. That's what I would like to mention. Despite, if you ask scientists, they would brag about how much we know, but actually what I'm struck by is how much we don't know. And if you think about another civilization that had 1 million years, not a century, but 1 million years to develop science, they might know much more. And they would know so much that they can maybe create life in their laboratories. Maybe they can create a baby universe in their laboratories. So one way for us to have a jump start is to learn from them. And not to be so arrogant to think that we are the pinnacle of creation.
Right. You mentioned spirituality a second ago. We know from art historians that many medieval paintings show evidence of UFOs in the sky, including Virgin Mary's immaculate conception of Jesus by a mysterious ray of light from literally coming from a UFO. There's one of the masters painted such a subject. The Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita all mention extraterrestrials, including extraterrestrial warfare. I don't know what the Torah has to say about it. Maybe the Kabbalah does. I don't know, but it would seem as if throughout the ages, UFOs and visitations from otherworldly visitors has preoccupied humankind. Can you comment on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a subject that humans were thinking about since the beginning, and unfortunately, we don't have solid evidence because there was no instrumentation in ancient times. We didn't have the kind of instruments we have now to record events, and there are reports on things that look quite unusual. And I should say also that the recorded human history is only 10,000 years old. So that's 1 millionth of the age of the Earth. And
right.
There could have been visits long before humans were around. We just came to exist sort of at the end of the Earth's history. Just in the last 1 millionth of the history of the Earth, we have recorded the reports about what humans witnessed. So we just don't know what happened long before that. And even during ancient times when people talked about unusual miracles or phenomena, we don't know how reliable these reports are. They are less reliable than pilots reporting about unidentified objects to the U.S. government. And I think the best approach is actually to try and see it again, because science is about reproducibility of results. So let's just use the best instruments we have now. They never existed before. Previous generations could not have benefited from them. And, if these things are out there, we should be able to see them. And right. I think that's the best approach.
It seems to me that it's indisputable that they're out there. And for me, the strongest evidence is the visitations over nuclear power plants and nuclear missile bases. We know for certain by testimony from uniformed officers that the Minot Air Force Base in Wyoming was shut down by unidentified flying objects hovering over the base. There is the September 2020 incident at Arizona's Palo Verde nuclear power plant, where again, the power plant was visited and in part shut down. These UFOs seem to have a particular interest in anything nuclear. And we know for certain that airspace over anything nuclear is extremely restricted. It's totally restricted. These are sightings that are difficult to explain away. Do you have any theories as to why sightings that we have sightings over nuclear bases and nuclear power plants?
Yeah, well, these are the areas that are most monitored, and so it's natural that we have most of the reports coming from there. it's not clear that other areas are not visited as much. It's just that they're not being monitored. If you look at the UFO reports, UAP reports, the first correlation you find is with population density. The more eyes you have in the sky, the more reports you get. So it's not clear at the moment whether there are more events near nuclear facilities or just there are more instruments looking at the sky near these facilities. And one way to find out is by the Galileo project, going to different locations, some of which have nothing to do with nuclear plants, and just comparing how many events are being seen. But at the moment, we don't have that kind of data.
Right.
Yeah.
We have about 2 minutes, and if you would just briefly summarize what your latest book that was published in 2021, Extraterrestrial, includes or is about, or the premise, that would be great before we have to say goodbye.
Yeah, so my book, Extraterrestrial, talks about the first object that was reported from outside the solar system, Oumuamua, and how strange its properties were, so that it could have been of technological origin from outside the solar system, which makes it the very first sign of extraterrestrial intelligence. And the book was translated to 25 languages and became a bestseller in many countries. I'm currently working on my next book and also on a documentary. And the very next, and every few days I have a commentary in Medium that anyone can read about the latest work that I'm doing. And the most exciting next step is actually the expedition to Papua New Guinea, where we will look at an object that was discovered 4 years before Oumuamua, and trying to figure out the composition of the fragments left over from it, because the key question is whether it was rock or maybe of artificial origin, which we can tell by the composition.
Right. Well, we're going to need to say goodbye. It's 57 minutes past the hour. Dr. Professor Loeb, thank you for joining us. We will be in touch.
Thank you so much, Dr. Loeb. It's been a real honor speaking to you. I hope to meet you in person someday. I am extremely interested in your research and just the breadth of perspective that you bring to it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting me. It was a pleasure.
You bet. So we've been speaking with Abraham Loeb. Dr. Avi Loeb is the Frankie Baird Jr. Professor of Science at Harvard University. And as you mentioned, he has the most recent book, Extraterrestrial. In 2012, he was Time Magazine selected as one of the 25 most influential people in space.